Hi, I'm Dr. Nafhesa Ali. I'm a lecturer in sociology in the Department of Social Sciences at Northumbria University, which is based in Newcastle in the United Kingdom. I'm both a lecturer and interdisciplinary researcher whose work focuses on the everyday lives of racialised and minority groups, where I examine the themes of ageing and migration for older settled migrants who have aged in their place of migration and settlement. I'm also interested in themes such as intersectional sexualities, environmental sustainability, looking at global North and global South comparisons, and creative methods applying film, storytelling, and literature to aid inclusion in research. This keynote talk draws attention to the topic of inclusive research methods, intersectional perspectives, and the aim of this talk is to demonstrate how inclusive research methods can be adopted by researchers to create an inclusive research culture that increases the inclusion of seldom heard and underrepresented groups, for example. Inclusive research methods can benefit the study of gender, age, and other intersections such as sexualities, disabilities, race, and culture by providing a more comprehensive understanding of the experiences and perspectives of diverse groups. These methods can include a variety of data collection techniques, such as surveys, interviews, focus groups, and recruiting participants from a range of backgrounds. In addition, inclusive research can help to identify and address structural inequalities that may impact on the lives of marginalized groups. However, there are challenges to inclusive research methods. One challenge is that inclusive research can be more time-consuming and resource-intensive than more traditional research methods. Additionally, inclusive research can also be more complex and difficult to analyze, as data from diverse groups may not be directly comparable. So there is a risk of tokenizing or essentializing the experiences of these groups, which can lead to an inaccurate or incomplete understanding of their experiences. And finally, there may be ethical considerations that we need to keep in mind when working with vulnerable groups, but also groups that are seldom heard and overlooked, such as ensuring informed consent and protecting participant confidentiality. Some of these issues will be discussed in this presentation. So this presentation has four main aims. First, I will look at how intersectionality can nurture inclusive practices. Secondly, critically examine the ways in which the balance of power can change during the research process. And third, draw attention to how participants can be encouraged to have increased agency in shaping the research. Fourth, I will be looking at the ways in which we can look to promote collaborative ways of participatory and inclusive research. This presentation will additionally address how to draw attention to the ways in which we can guide the research process to meet the needs of the people we research with, whilst addressing academic protocols. At the end of the presentation, I will have drawn attention to the ways in which researchers engage with the themes of various intersections in relation to inclusive research practices, highlighted some of my own research which applies this framework to its methods, and you will have a greater understanding of how to engage with inclusive research practices, the use and application for it, and how to engage it in your own research. So what is inclusive research? Inclusive research is a research approach that aims to be representative of and responsive to the needs and perspectives of a diverse range of participants. This can include individuals from racial, ethnic, socioeconomic and cultural backgrounds, as well as those with disabilities, different sexual orientations and other marginalised identities. The goal of inclusive research is to ensure that the research process and findings accurately reflect the experiences and perspectives of all members of the population being studied, rather than just a select group of individuals. All inclusive research approaches incorporate diverse perspectives in the design, implementation of the study, including the recruitment of participants, data collection methods, and data analysis techniques. It also aims to address and challenge existing power imbalances and privilege within the research process, and this can include actively engaging with marginalised communities, using culturally sensitive and appropriate methods, and working to reduce barriers to participation for underrepresented groups. An inclusive research process is one that requires researchers to be active, but also situates the subjects for research as instigators of ideas within this method. It also allows you to examine how intersecting forms of inequality, for example, religion and race, can feed into and reconstruct spaces of inequality and oppression, which are underpinned by wider systems of domination. This breakdown of power between the researcher and research can also be applied in the context of the research process, the design of the research, but also the tools used to gather data and the delivery and dissemination of the research, where instruments such as surveys are co-produced by the individuals and groups and communities the researchers are working with. Empirical research often aims to create spaces of inclusion for groups who are overlooked, or where individual voices are ignored from mainstream discussion are brought to attention. This is often motivated by inclusion and drawing spaces for those who are often left out of the research, by including them and giving them the space to have a voice. Inclusive research extends participatory research methods as a breakdown of power between the researcher and research begins from the early stages all the way through to dissemination and delivery, with prompts for researchers to be more aware of equality, diversity and inclusion, EDI, in all aspects of the work. This workshop and presentation draws attention to the usefulness of inclusive methods to dismantle positions of power. Inclusive research centers the research participant in the research process, where participants will work with researchers to shape the research design, tools, and various other aspects of the research taking place. Therefore, it includes and recognizes previous tensions from participants where research being done on participants has pushed for calls to move towards more inclusive practices throughout the research process, which this presentation aims to fully address. What is intersectionality? To explore how intersectionality can nurture inclusive practices, we must first understand what this is. So intersectionality is a framework for understanding how different aspects of a person's identity, such as race, gender, class, and sexuality, intersect and interact to shape their experiences and opportunities. The concept of intersectionality emphasizes that people's experiences are not determined by any one aspect of their identity, but rather by the complex and dynamic interaction of multiple identities. For example, an individual who is born both a woman and a person of color may experience discrimination and oppression that is distinct from that experienced by a white woman or a man of color. Similarly, a transgender person may face unique challenges and discrimination that is different from that faced by cisgender individuals of the same race and socioeconomic class. Intersectionality also highlights how systems of oppression such as racism and sexism are interconnected and mutually reinforcing. The framework is often used in fields such as sociology, feminist theory, and critical race theory to analyze how multiple forms of oppression interact and impact on individuals and communities. In research, using an intersectional approach means considering how different identities and experiences intersect and shape that research question, data collection, analysis, and interpretation of the findings. It also involves actively seeking out and including diverse perspectives and recognizing and challenging any power imbalances that may exist in the research process. Patricia Hill Collins 2017 argues that there is no standard definition of intersectionality, but that most people categorize it in the following way. So 1. Intersectional differences such as class, gender, age, etc. 2. Structural on structures of social inequalities that are constructed within these intersections. And 3rd, how social actors are situated within power relations due to their historical or social contexts. Because of these locations within these intersections and their related oppressions, they have distinct standpoints. Intersectionality therefore sits in critical inquiry that reflects feminist theory and anti-racist politics, which was first introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. It originates from Black feminist critique that highlighted the issues and problems of having single-axis frameworks for the examination of categories such as gender and race. Crenshaw, in a 1989 paper demarginalizing the intersection of race and sex, argued that this previously used single-axis framework where gender or race has been examined through individual master categories, was problematic and erased the experiences of Black women in the conceptualization, identification, and remediation of race, sex, and discrimination. She claimed that feminist theory lacked value for Black women as it evolved from a white racial context which is seldom acknowledged, and as a result created privilege which continued to marginalize the experiences of minority groups, communities, and individuals, how they were positioned in the world and in relation to their subjective experiences through ways of knowing and doing, and how divisions of power and resistance came about as a result. Tricia Hill Collins, in her 2019 book, Intersectionality as Social Critical Theory, revisits this framework and adds that the deeply entrenched social inequalities would not disappear overnight, nor would the social problems that they engendered. She notes that this is a result of colonialism, racism, sexism, and nationalism, and as you can see here, there are a number of suffixes that are isms and represent words to a specific practice or system of philosophy in which these practices, systems, or philosophies, in this case, represent political ideologies or relate to a belief system as accepted by a group or school of thought. Yet the interconnectedness of these social problems, Tricia Hill Collins suggests, provides new opportunities for social change. To understand this, we need to recognize that before intersectionality, race, gender, class, and various other categories were categories in their own right. Master categories, separate to each other, known as single axes, which created add-ons and not intersections. The issue with master categories and separation suggests that everything has one place, a place and a meaning only in relation to other places, and every place has its rank. This separation, which creates hierarchies, underpins racism, sexism, heterosexism, nationalism, colonialism, and similar structures of power. There are multi-dimensions attached to intersectionality, and intersectionality alone isn't the answer to multiple intersections individuals hold. However, it is one part in the way in which we can begin to understand how we can move forward in creating increased spaces for inclusion within our research process and approach. Applying an intersectional lens allows the structural inequalities that cause the othering of some groups while privileging others, who are often marked or unmarked by race, gender, class, or immigration status, for example, results in the invisibilization of these groups. Spaces of inclusion from which we can begin to understand additional sites of intersecting power and privilege may be held through various social positions. So to examine relations of power and how they can change during the research process, we must understand that power can play a key role in the research process in various ways. It can influence the selection of research topics and questions, the design of studies, the interpretation of results, and the dissemination of findings. Those with more power, such as researchers in higher positions or with more resources, may have more control over the direction and outcome of the research. Additionally, power imbalances can also affect the ability of certain groups to participate in research and have their perspectives and experiences represented. It's also important to be aware of power dynamics in the research process and to strive for inclusivity and fairness. These boundaries of separation are telling of how power is exercised in deciding who gets to do the intellectual work in the first place. Challenging oppression within distinct categories means that you only tackle one issue at a time. Single axis boundary making creates separation and spaces of the ways in which power can be mobilized. When the number of categories are looked at separately, this is not enough. We must look at their overlapping intersections. Kimberly Crenshaw, 1989 and 1995, Mapping the Margins, argues that anti-racist and feminist movements were overlooking the experiences of Black women, where race was understood to protect Black men and feminism was understood to protect white women. Combining them together as add-on did not protect Black women. So it was not only an issue with the categories, but also the structures and institutional discourses, sometimes reified existing power relations that produced and legitimized these power relations. There were then additional intersections at play, and there's a need to understand privilege and power through our interconnectedness, and how the interplay of multiple intersections adds to the experience of oppression. For example, race and gender, but there may also be ageism, sexism, etc. at play within and across these intersections. Intersectionality allows you to understand each unique oppression, but also how they change in combination. Intersectionality also allows you to look at our own privileges, which may be excluded as a result of our own intersections and our own ways of knowing or being in the world. Intersectionality and intersecting identities are therefore not the same. Intersectionality looks at the multiple systematic oppressions. Intersecting identities are often applied by people who have privilege due to their own identities. Identities thus gives them space to equate their own identities, but ignores the systematic oppressions that are at play, which can often lead to oppression Olympics, where two people equate their experiences are the same. People who participate in oppression Olympics tend to ignore the multiple people can experience oppression not just as one over the other, for example, but this can be dangerous and conflict can occur due to confusing intersectionality and intersectional identities. Participant agency, then, refers to the ability of research participants to be able to make informed choices about their involvement in a research study and to have a voice in the research process. This can include things like giving informed consent, choosing to participate or not, and providing feedback on the research design and interpretation of results. The concept of participant agency is important in research because it acknowledges that participants are not passive subjects, but rather active agents who have the right to make decisions about their own involvement in the research. When participants have agency, they are more likely to be engaged and invested in the research process, which can lead to more meaningful and valuable data. Incorporating participant agency in the research design can shape research in several ways. It can ensure that the research is relevant to the participants, that the process is respectful and ethical, and that the results are more likely to be generalizable and useful to the participants' communities. It also helps us to promote trust and collaboration between researcher and participants, which is important for the success of research. To ensure participants can have agency in shaping the research, it is important to consider the methods of your research and the way in which you choose to do your research. Often standard procedures are taken into consideration, but this does not always fit in with the sample you aim to research. Therefore, to allow participants agency in shaping the research, it is important to consider the following. Applying the framework of, for example, decolonial work, see Lagunes 2010 and 2020, is a useful framework for inclusive methods. Hill Collins 1996 suggests that often tensions occur when there is a departure from knowledge that is assumed or taken for granted, and where individual experiences are not given the space or recognition to be autonomous. Smith 2020 adds that the construction of knowledge and the ways of knowing create sites where power can be reclaimed, and agency and autonomy privilege culturally specific ways of thinking, being, and knowing. This knowledge is not to be told by others who rewrite them as perspectives of their own for the narratives, or for the narratives to be taken and then ignored, but need to rightfully be communicated and received within the historical or social context in which they occur. In turn, this can only be achieved by examining what is hidden from our understanding of both race and gender, and the relation of each of these to each other, in addition to what is constructed as what may be seen as deviant and why. In interviews, participants can have agency when conducting interview methods by taking an active role in the process and making sure their perspectives and experiences are accurately represented. This can include the following. Preparing for the interview, participants can familiarize themselves with the topic of the interview and the questions that will be asked, and think about how they want to present their experiences and perspectives. Communicating their needs, where participants can express their needs and concerns to the interview and take an active role in shaping the interview process. For example, they can request breaks or ask for clarification on certain questions. Providing informed consent. Participants should be informed of the purpose of the interview, how the data will be used and shared, and their rights to withdraw from the study. Reflection on their experiences. Participants can reflect on their experiences and perspectives and make sure that data collected is true to their experiences. They can also ask for a copy of the transcript or recordings of the interview to review. Sharing feedback. Participants can provide feedback on the interview process and any recommendations for future research. By taking an active role in the interview process, participants can ensure that their perspectives and experiences are accurately represented and that the research reflects their experience. When we look at survey design, for example, examples of participants taking an active role in the research process may include refining questions to address the project and aims, being conscious of data at particular levels, such as level of constructing the data, input and delivery and dissemination, ensuring that we have included a number of themes and themes of interest around local and global levels when we're looking at the experiences of, for example, recently arrived migrants. The next two are particularly relevant when considering ways in which the survey could be more inclusive to the participant, and this includes addressing feedback on, for example, the time it will take to complete the survey, considering the survey would also need to be interpreted or translated, for example. Ensuring that language used in the survey is simple for translation and interpretation, and that content will be understood by the respondents without being patronizing or too simple for the sample. Ways in which we can include inclusion in ethnographies and ways that participants can have agency include, for example, collaboration, where participants can work with the researcher to develop the research question, design, study, and collect data. This can give participants a sense of ownership of the research process and ensure that perspectives and experiences are accurately represented. Giving informed consent, where participants should be informed of the purpose of the study, how the data will be used, and their rights to withdraw from the study. Other areas include, for example, active participation, reflexivity, representation, and reciprocity. By taking an active role in the ethnographic research process, participants can ensure that their perspectives and experiences are accurately represented and that the research reflects their experiences. We can also look at the ways in which we can promote collaborative ways of participatory and inclusive research. And this can be to include and embed a more inclusive framework that includes working closely with external organisations, individuals, local authority and government, grassroots, faith groups and others to map the landscape in which we conduct our research, but also ensure that we're able to reach a range of participants within our population group through this collaborative approach. So to conclude, to make moves towards more inclusive research, there's an importance and centrality for critical thinking when exploring the experiences and practicalities of overlooked or minority groups and broader discourse of inclusion. This includes being aware of our own positionalities and positions during the research. We need to be reflexive of how structures are organised and reflect on how the participants can shape, engage and mobilise the research process, but also its approach. We can also reflect on experiences at different levels, which includes inclusive discourse for policy agendas and initiatives. So to end, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'm Dr. Nafhesa Ali.